Hi, I'm Marangella from Vertex Effects. Today I'm going to give you my top tips on how to make the quietest possible pedal board by optimizing your routing for your power cables and audio cables. We're often asked by people who see pictures of our rigs about whether there's any real benefit to separating their audio cables from their power cables, or from routing their audio cables or their power cables in specific ways. I have here Rhett Shull's pedal board, which is one that I've been working on over the last week, and I think that this is a great example of how to do appropriate routing of the power and audio cables, because ordinarily there actually isn't going to be much benefit for you to separate your power from your audio cables. But in this particular case, we have not only a bunch of DC cables and a bunch of DC powered pedals, but we also have some AC powered pedals here, like the Sir Henry Univibe by Tinsley Audio that takes a hardwired AC cable. And then how we do the workaround and how you make your choices on where to route cables, and also just best practices around how to choose the right power supply, where to put pedals in relationship to the power supply, and how you can make sure that when you're building your rig, you're accounting for where the noise issues might be and mitigating those as much as possible. So the first thing that I always like to do when I'm building a rig is make the determination of what type of power supply I have. There's really two different types. There is what's called a linear power supply, which uses a transformer inside, usually a C-core or an R-core or a toroid transformer, or is a switch mode power supply. Switch mode is kind of the newest, fanciest supplies that most of the companies are going to. So these would be companies like Strymon, True Tone, Chalks. Those primarily focus on switch mode supplies, or at least are moving their line into being fully switch mode power supplies. Whereas a lot of the power supplies of old, like the Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 2, Mondo, 4x4, those are examples of linear power supplies. Now, both can work on a pedal board, but the thing you need to be aware of if you're using a linear power supply is it really needs to be as far away from the pedals as possible, because they have that transformer. It emits what's called EMF, an electromagnetic field. And if you get any of your pedals or your signal cables into that magnetic field, you can often have a problem, especially when you're using a rig that requires that you mount the power supply underneath the pedals and you have pedals sitting directly on top of it. So if you do have one of those types of boards, it's advisable that you go with a switch mode power supply, because firstly, there's no consequence of putting it right underneath the pedals. You're not dealing with the same electromagnetic field. It doesn't have any of those concerns. Secondly, switch mode power supplies are very efficient, so it can generate more power than a linear power supply in a smaller package, lighter weight, and it also can be used anywhere in the world. It will automatically recalibrate the voltage coming from the wall and just make sure that everything is getting a steady 9 volts or whatever voltage you've adjusted it to if it has a variable voltage, without any issue whatsoever. So that is my first tip, is to determine what type of power supply you have and whether you need to move it to a specific location away from other pedals if it's a linear power supply, versus a switch mode where you can really put it anywhere. Now on Rhett's pedal board, kind of going underneath the hood here, you can see that he's got a Zuma, that is a switch mode power supply, so there really is no consequence of having pedals near it at all. But there is one thing here that I do want to talk about in terms of best practices when you do have AC. So you can see here in the Sir Henry, right up here in the front, it has a hardwired IEC cable. And if you look on the routing of how I've done this, is I've kind of separated the AC line from all of my audio cables, because I know that if I bundle this with the audio cables, then I could have a risk for some noise issues. So I've really tried to set it off back away from it. I've kind of given it its own routing channel and then brought it into this power strip. Separately, equally, I'm running a right angle IEC out of the Zuma and running that into the power strip as well, and just trying to make sure that that stays somewhat away from any of the pedals. Now I do have one pedal that's sitting directly above the power strip, which is the Delay Llama right here, but I did some testing to make sure that I wasn't having any issues with getting this too close to the AC source. I couldn't detect any noise issues no matter what I did, and it could just be that this is a little far enough away from it, a couple inches away in proximity from the circuit, that it didn't cause any issue whatsoever. But again, it's always good to check. So when you ask the question, is it important to separate your audio cable from your power cable? Ordinarily, the answer is no, because DC will not have the same problem. But if you do have AC, like you have with this Univibe, you would want to keep them separated and try to give it its own path. And if it is going to cross, again, going back underneath, You can see in the places where I do cross the audio, I do it in a perpendicular fashion. I don't line them up side by side. So if I am going to cross, that's the best way to ensure that you're not going to inject any noise as a result of having your AC lines too close to your audio cables. Now, another thing that I like to do, and this isn't for any particular reason for noise, but people often do ask me if we separate audio from DC, and I really don't. I mean, you can see here that I have DC and I have my audio lines together, and again, as I said, this is all such low voltage, all low current. There's really no consequence of doing that, and we kind of mix it throughout the pedal board, so that is not something that you need to do to ensure that you're getting the quietest possible pedal board. But I will tell you one thing that is very important, is another one of my tips for the quietest possible pedal board, which is using high quality soldered cables. Now, throughout the whole rig here on Rhett's board, I have Mogami 2314 soldered cables. I'm using right angle style pancake connectors from Square Plug. Those are all soldered. By going soldered, you're again not risking any issue with the reliability of the cable. It's a gas-tight connection, whereas no solderless connection for this particular industry is technically gas-tight. Maybe it could start its life gas-tight, but as soon as you manipulate it or do anything to the cable, it's not going to be gas-tight anymore. So having high-quality soldered cables is absolutely going to give you a great result. Even if you can't wire it nicely as we have here and it's got a little bit more slop to it, that's not actually going to affect the tone. It might look not as pleasing as this, but as long as you don't have any AC lines like I have here and you've separated them, you're not going to have any issue whether you're mixing and matching the DC and the audio cable and your cable limbs. It's just not going to be an issue for you in 99.9% of the context. One more tip that I like to utilize in order to make sure that I have the quietest possible board is actually something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. It actually is using buffers. Now, in Rhett's pedal board, I have a buffer on the output, and we are relying on some of the pedal buffers internally in order to condition the lines so that he gets the least amount of signal loss as possible. However, buffers can be really good because they're isolating the impedances on the pedal board, resolving some noise issues. In fact, sometimes you'll have certain pedals that might have some sensitivity if they don't have the right impedances, and you can get some odd noises, you can get some oscillation and things like that. So making sure that everything is getting a high quality buffer on the input and output, presuming that you don't have a fuzz like Rhett does. If he didn't have that fuzz there, I would put a buffer right up front to make sure that everything was getting that high quality low impedance signal. But for most of us, if we're not using fuzzes, you could stand to have a buffer right at the beginning, right at the end, and that's going to ensure that you're not going to have any weird variables inside of the pedals themselves because all the impedances will be controlled. They're not going to be beholden to the environment that they're in. I think that that is the best way to ensure that not only are you having the best possible signal, but you're also optimized for the lowest possible noise in combination with all those things. So again, recapping. Making sure that you know your power supply. Is it switch mode? Is it linear? And putting it in the appropriate place, knowing what it does and knowing what its drawbacks are and how to isolate it as best as possible so you don't have any noise. Second, not worrying about separating your audio cables and your DC. As we know, as long as it's low voltage, low current, you're not going to have any issue. But if you do have an AC cable like we do in the Sir Henry, you want to make sure that that's as far away from your audio as you can possibly make it. And if you are going to cross the audio with the AC, you do that in a perpendicular fashion. Third thing we learned about, you're going to need to have high quality soldered cables. These cables that we use, like the Mogami, they're all shielded, high quality, stranded shield, stranded center conductor. These are going to ensure that even if you do have some AC lines and they're crossing, it's going to reject any of that noise. You're not going to have any issue. It's a gas-tight connection. And lastly, fourth thing, having a high-quality buffer on the input and output. Although this seems counterintuitive, that adding more circuitry would actually make the signal quieter, it will reduce issues and variabilities between pedals. You have this leapfrog of impedances going on your pedal board. When each pedal is feeding into the next, you might have bad quality buffers. You might have some pedals that need to have a buffer in front of it in order to eliminate some of the issues. Having a high quality input and output buffer is going to ensure that you are getting a consistent signal across the board and that you're not going to have any variability depending on the cables that you're using or how long the cable is on the output of the system. It's going to give you a hardware firewall for the input and the output of the system. It's going to make sure that these variables don't translate back into the amp and that the guitar is not affected by these variables. So those are my tips for the quietest possible pedal board and some of our routing best practices. This was again Rhett Shull's rig. We're happy to get this thing back to him, and I'm happy to use this as an exemplar for you today. If you have any questions about your rig or how to optimize for the quietest possible rig, please feel free to put those in the comments. And if you like what you saw today, be sure to like, subscribe, and also, again, leave us a comment, tell us what you liked. And if you want to support, you can do that with us on Patreon, where we offer one-on-one coaching to people just like you with rigs just like this. Or you could go to our website, buy one of our products. That always helps us out, just like Red here has our Ultraphonics HRM. We also have merch linked below right here on YouTube. If you're interested in any of our apparel and clothing, please do check that out. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, aka The Rig Doctor. See you later.